Anyone who gets me out gets a $100 million rewards!
Whoever gets me out gets $100 million. Those words rolled like thunder through the crowded street. The air trembled. Police sirens screamed, red and blue lights flashing against the white walls of the mansion. Dozens of armed officers surrounded the front gate. Helicopters hovered above, blades slicing the humid afternoon air. And in the middle of it all stood Don Carlos Santos, the most feared man in the country. He was calm, dressed in a dark suit, not a wrinkle on his face, not a single sign of fear. Cameras clicked from every direction. News reporters fought for space to capture the image. The king finally brought to justice. But when he spoke, the world froze. Whoever gets me out gets $100 million. For a heartbeat, silence. Even the wind seemed to stop. Then chaos. People screamed, some laughing, others shouting to each other. Many didn't believe what they'd heard. "He's bluffing," someone shouted. But others stood still, staring with wide eyes. They knew Don Carlo, the man of his word. The man who never joked about money. The man whose promises were as real as death. Minutes earlier, the police had stormed his mansion under orders from President Elias Navarro, the new leader who had sworn to end Don Carlo's reign. The mission had a name, Operation Purity, and it was meant to bring justice after 2 decades of fear, corruption, and blood. But Don Carlo had known they were coming. His reach extended everywhere: judges, ministers, officers, and even the drivers who carried the president's messages. His informants had warned him hours before the first siren wailed. His men, his loyal guards and lieutenants, had rushed into his study. "Boss," one whispered, panic in his voice, "they're coming. We need to move. The jets are ready. Say the word." Don Carlo had looked up slowly from his glass of wine. He smiled, the calm, dangerous smile that had made grown men tremble. "Carlos Santos runs from no man," he said. "If they take me on my throne." Those words sealed his fate. Instead of fleeing, he dressed like a ruler about to meet his court, black suit, gold cufflinks, and polished shoes. He walked through his mansion one last time, passing through marble halls and silent portraits of himself beside leaders, businessmen, and foreign dignitaries. Outside, the sound of sirens grew louder. Dozens of armored trucks filled his driveway. Agents in black shouted orders. Still, Don Carlo didn't flinch. When they finally broke through his doors, they found him waiting in his study, hands clasped behind his back. No resistance. No fight. Only the faint scent of cologne and the quiet confidence of a man who knew his own power. The officers shouted for him to get down. He did not move. One brave captain stepped forward, gun drawn but voice shaking. "Don Carlos Santos, you are under arrest." Carlo nodded, as if he had just been invited to a meeting. He raised his hands slowly. "Be gentle," he said. "You're touching history." They led him outside, surrounded by a wall of soldiers, cameras flashing like lightning around him. He wasn't handcuffed, no one dared. The officers feared that even the smallest disrespect might have consequences beyond their understanding. And that's when he stopped on the front steps. He turned toward the sea of faces beyond the police barricades, hundreds of people watching. Ordinary citizens, street boys, business owners, even rival gang members. Everyone had come to see if the legend was truly over. Then he said it again, louder this time, his voice calm but firm. "Whoever gets me out gets $100 million. The crowd gasped. Some laughed nervously. Others shouted in excitement. The words hung in the air like smoke, thick, heavy, unforgettable. For a few seconds, the entire nation seemed to hold its breath. The police pushed him into the van and slammed the door shut, but it was too late. His voice had already escaped into the world. Within minutes, the video was online. Within an hour, it was everywhere, on television, phones, radios, and social media. People replayed it over and over again. "Whoever gets me out gets $100 million. In the prisons, inmates whispered it in the dark. In the slums, gang leaders started calling meetings. In the government halls, officials looked at each other with quiet fear. Don Carlos Santos had spoken, and even from behind bars, his words had power. That evening, as the sun went down, the city glowed with flashing screens showing his arrest. The president watched the footage from his office, his jaw tight, his heart heavy. He didn't know it yet, but those words had just started a war. A war between the government and the streets, between law and loyalty, between a man and a myth. And the people whispered one thing over and over. If the Don said it, he'll do it. The storm had begun. To understand why the nation trembled, you have to know the man behind the name. Don Carlos Santos was not born a king. He was forged in the gutters of San Meridio, a rough port city where the smell of salt, sweat, and gunpowder filled the air. It was a city that chewed people up and spat them out. In San Meridio you either learned to fight, steal, or starve. Carlo learned all three. He was the son of a poor dock worker and a street vendor. His father died when he was 10, crushed by a falling cargo container. His mother followed 2 years later, killed by a stray bullet during a gang fight at the marketplace. From that day Carlo became an orphan, a boy with no home, no money, and no mercy. He slept in abandoned boats, stole food from vendors, and ran errands for whoever would pay him. By the time he was 14, everyone at the docks knew him. The quiet boy with the cold eyes who never forgot a face and never forgave a debt. As a teenager he started working for the dock thieves, a group of smugglers who controlled the loading yards. He carried messages, counted shipments, and watched everything. Within a few years he wasn't just watching anymore, he was learning. He learned how to talk his way out of danger, how to buy silence with fear, and how to turn small secrets into big power. By 25 he didn't run errands, he ran the entire dock. The old thieves who had once mocked him either disappeared or worked under him. By 30, Don Carlos Santos owned not just the docks but the police who guarded them, the customs officers who inspected them, and the judges who pretended to fight corruption. But Carlo was different from the typical gangsters. He didn't rule with guns alone. He ruled with information. He knew that bullets killed bodies but secrets destroyed souls. So he built a network of spies, drivers, secretaries, waiters, even priests, people who heard the things that powerful men wanted buried. Every handshake he gave, every favor he offered, came with a silent cost: knowledge. He collected files, recordings, documents, anything that could destroy the lives of those who thought they were untouchable. Soon he had every powerful person in his pocket. Senators, businessmen, generals, judges. If someone crossed him, he didn't send a gunman, he sent a scandal. A leaked video. A secret bank account. A photo that should never have existed. And just like that, his enemies fell one by one, not in blood but in disgrace. That's why even presidents whispered his name. He wasn't just feared, he was untouchable. They called him Don Carlo, but on the streets he was known as the King of Men, the man who could make or break anyone with a single phone call. Every business deal, every election, every major decision in the country somehow passed through his invisible hands. When the government raised taxes, he decided who paid and who didn't. When someone went to prison, he decided how long they stayed. He became more than a man, he became a shadow government. But power always attracts enemies. And one day someone dared to defy him. His name was Governor Rafael Mendoza, a proud, ambitious man who once served under Carlo's influence but later turned against him. When Mendoza's wife was murdered in her home, all signs pointed to Don Carlos Santos. Everyone knew it. Everyone whispered it. Mendoza swore revenge. He gathered evidence, called secret meetings, and promised to bring the Don to justice. He even contacted foreign agents, hoping to expose the truth to the world. But Carlo was always 10 steps ahead. Before the governor could act, Carlo's men released a series of files to the public: bank transfers, hidden properties, videos of meetings that Mendoza thought were private. In less than 24 hours, Mendoza went from hunter to hunted. He was impeached, disgraced, and abandoned by everyone who once supported him. Some say he fled the country. Others say his body was found near the old port, the same place where Carlo's power began. After that, no one ever challenged Don Carlos Santos again. He became more than a name. He became a law of nature, a force that everyone respected and feared. Government officials bowed in silence when he entered a room. Police chiefs took orders from his men. Even church leaders came to bless his home during holidays, pretending not to see the guns hidden beneath the table. To the poor, he was a godfather, a man who gave food, paid hospital bills, and protected them from smaller gangs. To the rich, he was a devil, a reminder that no amount of wealth could save them if they crossed him. For 20 years, he ruled quietly, untouchable and unseen, the invisible king of a corrupted nation. And so, when he finally fell, the world trembled, because no one believed it could ever happen. He was Don Carlos Santos. He was the king of men. Then came Elias Navarro, the man who would change everything. Navarro wasn't born into power. He earned it with sweat, scars, and a name built from courage. He was a decorated soldier, a war hero who had fought in the country's most violent conflicts. He came from the mountains, from a humble family that had taught him the value of truth and justice. People loved him because he was clean in a world full of dirt. He had seen corruption destroy lives during his years in service, and he had sworn that if he ever had power, he would never become one of them. When he entered politics, Many thought he would be eaten alive. He didn't come from money. He didn't have the backing of the rich or the powerful. But he had something rarer, the trust of the people. His campaign speeches weren't filled with promises. They were filled with conviction. And when he finally took office, he made one clear vow to the nation. We will end the reign of Don Carlos Santos. The country held its breath. No one had dared to speak that name openly in years. Even the news stations avoided it. But Navarro said it with fire in his voice in front of the world. When Don Carlo heard the speech, he didn't get angry, he laughed. They all promise, he said to his men, sipping wine at the long table in his marble dining room. Then they learned to kneel. His lieutenants laughed nervously, though none of them found it funny. They knew Navarro wasn't like the others. But Carlo believed no man could touch him. For 20 years he had controlled presidents, judges and generals. To him, Elias Navarro was just another loud politician who would eventually reach for a deal instead of a fight. He was wrong. Navarro was different. He wasn't interested in money, bribes, or favors. He was a soldier at heart, not a businessman. He had seen his fellow men die fighting for justice, and he wasn't about to bow to a man who ruled through fear. Carlo underestimated him, and when powerful men underestimate, they make mistakes. The first attempt on Navarro's life came during a campaign rally. It was a bright afternoon in the capital. The crowd was large, waving flags and chanting Navarro's name. As he stepped out of his car and raised his hand to greet the people, a deafening explosion shook the ground. A car parked nearby went up in flames, tearing through the air with a roar. Panic spread instantly. Dozens were injured, but by a miracle, Navarro survived. He had stepped away from the blast at the last second to greet a child holding a flag. That small moment of kindness saved his life. Investigators found the car had been rigged with high-grade explosives. Every trail led to one name, Don Carlos Santos. But the president didn't flinch. He increased security, tightened investigations, and swore that he would not rest until the Don was behind bars. The second attempt was quieter, more precise. A sniper, one of Carlos' best, was placed on a rooftop near the presidential residence. He had one clear shot through a window where Navarro often worked late into the night. But fate has strange timing. That very night, Navarro's wife entered his office to bring him coffee. The shot missed him by inches, shattering glass and plunging the palace into chaos. The shooter was captured days later. Before his execution, he confessed who had sent him. The name was already known to everyone, but hearing it aloud turned anger into fury. Don Carlos Santos. The people started calling Navarro the Lion of Justice. They said he could not be killed because truth itself was protecting him. His survival inspired millions. For the first time in decades, the people began to believe that Don Carlos' rule could actually end. Carlo, however, grew restless. The failed assassinations had made him appear vulnerable, something he had never been. His men could see it too. The Don began losing patience. He doubled his efforts to find a weakness in Navarro's armor, but there was none. The man had no secrets to expose, no debts to exploit, no fear to use. 6 months after Navarro became president, he appeared on every screen in the country. The broadcast was simple, but his words carried the weight of history. He stood behind a podium, his uniform crisp, his medals gleaming, his voice steady. No man stands above the law. Today we bring the king to justice. It wasn't just a declaration. It was a challenge, a roar from one lion to another. Across the nation everyone felt it. Some trembled, others cheered. And in a grand mansion overlooking the city, Don Carlos Santos sat in silence, his cigar burning down between his fingers. For the first time in many years he didn't laugh. He simply muttered, "So it begins." And from that moment the hunters began to close in. The afternoon the police surrounded the mansion, the city held its breath. It was as if the whole nation had stopped moving, waiting to see if the legend would finally fall. Helicopters cut through the clouds, their blades slicing the air with sharp, rhythmic beats. Black SUVs filled the long road leading to Don Carlos gates, their tinted windows reflecting the afternoon sun. Dozens of armored trucks lined the perimeter, each one filled with heavily armed men. Journalists gathered in crowds, shouting questions no one could answer, cameras flashing like lightning before a storm. The mansion, a 4-hectare fortress of marble, glass and power, stood silent, its tall black gates closed like the jaws of a beast. Inside, Don Carlos Santos was calm. He stood in front of a tall mirror, adjusting the gold cufflinks on his crisp white shirt. His reflection looked back at him, composed, proud and fearless. "When a lion is caged," he murmured, "the jungle watches." His men paced nervously around him. Some had rifles in their hands, others had sweat on their brows. They could hear the helicopters above, the distant orders from loudspeakers, and the heavy boots moving into position. "Boss," said Rico, his closest lieutenant, his voice shaking slightly. "We have to move. There's still time. We can take the back route. The jet's waiting." Carlo turned slowly to face him. His eyes were calm but sharp, like knives in candlelight. "Run? From who?" he asked quietly. "A man with a badge? A man with a speech?" He smiled faintly and fixed his tie. "If they take me, they take me standing. Not crawling." His men said nothing. None dared argue. They knew their Don, a man who never feared death because death itself feared him. Outside the order was given. "Move in." The gates exploded open. The sound of breaking steel echoed through the hills. SWAT teams flooded the estate, black uniforms swarming through marble halls and long corridors. Boots slammed on tile floors, doors were kicked open and shouts filled the air. But there was no fight. No gunfire. No chaos. When the officers reached the grand living room, they found Don Carlo waiting for them, standing beneath a chandelier worth more than most of their homes. He raised his hands slowly, his face calm, almost amused. "Don Carlo Santos," the lead officer said, his voice tight. "You're under arrest." The Don nodded once, as if the officer had just told him something he already knew. "Be gentle," he said with the faintest trace of a smile. "You're touching history." They surrounded him with rifles drawn, but he didn't flinch. The tension in the room was thick enough to taste. Even the most hardened officers could feel their hands shake. They were arresting not just a man, but a legend. When they led him outside, the crowd roared. Hundreds of people had gathered beyond the police barricades. Some shouted insults. Others prayed. But most just stared, their phones raised, recording every step. The Don walked slowly down the steps, surrounded by soldiers, journalists, and flashing cameras. There were no handcuffs on his wrists. None dared put them on him. And then he stopped. He turned toward the crowd, his people, his city, his kingdom. He stood tall, his dark hair glinting under the sun, his eyes hard as stone. Silence fell. Even the helicopters seemed to pause above him. And in that silence he spoke, his voice clear, deep, and calm. $100 million to anyone who gets me out." The words hit like thunder. For a second no one moved. The police froze. The journalists lowered their microphones. The crowd stared, wide-eyed and speechless. Then came the chaos. Screams. Shouts. The noise of disbelief and greed mixing in the air. "He's serious," someone yelled. "Did you hear that? $100 million. Phones buzzed as the video spread instantly across the internet. Within minutes, every news station was replaying the same clip. The Don's calm face, his powerful voice, his impossible offer. Inside police headquarters, the commander shouted orders to silence the media. But it was too late. The genie was out of the bottle. By evening, every prison cell, every bar, every street corner buzzed with the same words. $100 million to anyone who gets him out. The president himself watched the broadcast from his office. His hands tightened into fists. He knew those words would travel faster than any bullet, deeper than any wound. And outside, in the dark alleys and hidden corners of San Meridio, men began whispering, making calls, forming plans. The nation didn't know it yet, but the fire had already been lit. Because Don Carlos Santos didn't just surrender that day. He declared war, with a smile and with a single promise. The myth was reborn. By nightfall the streets boiled. The sun had barely set when chaos began to spread across San Meridio and beyond. Smoke rose from the slums, sirens screamed in the distance, and the sound of shouting echoed from every corner of the city. Don Carlos' words, $100 million to anyone who gets me out, had already become more than a promise. They had become a call to war. In every alley men gathered in whispers. In every bar strangers argued about who would dare to try. Some said it was suicide. Others said it was destiny. Gangs who once hated each other now sat at the same tables, planning, scheming, plotting. They brought out weapons that had been hidden for years, rusty rifles, shotguns, pistols, machetes. Some polished them carefully, others kissed them like holy relics. Everywhere you looked there was tension, raw, sharp, and ready to explode. Even in prisons the air grew thick with noise. Inmates shouted Don Carlos' name through the bars, banging metal plates against the walls. Rumors spread that he had already bribed guards, that an escape was coming, that anyone helping would be rich beyond imagination. Wardens ordered lockdowns. Riot police filled the halls. But the spark had already caught fire. Ordinary citizens weren't spared from the fever either. In shops, in taxis, in schools, people talked of nothing else. What if it's real? They asked. What if he really pays? To them it wasn't just about greed. It was about belief. For 2 decades, Don Carlos Santos had been more than a man. He was a myth, a ruler in the shadows. Many had grown up fearing him, hearing stories of his power. Now for the first time they saw him in chains, yet still commanding a nation with his voice alone. President Elias Navarro watched all this unfold with cold fury. From his office he saw the flames on the horizon and heard the reports. Prisons in chaos, soldiers on edge, citizens turning restless. He knew this was not just rebellion, it was influence. It was proof that Don Carlos' hold over the people was stronger than fear of the law. And so he answered with iron. That very night, Navarro made an emergency broadcast to the nation. The cameras focused on his stern face, his eyes burning with resolve. Anyone who attempts to free him will be executed. The words hit the country like a hammer. They were not a warning, they were a death sentence. Police were given new orders: shoot to kill. No arrests. No mercy. Soldiers filled the streets. Roadblocks were built around prisons. Armored trucks patrolled the highways. Helicopters hovered above rooftops through the night, their searchlights sweeping across neighborhoods like hunting eyes. But even fear couldn't stop the hunger for $100 million. Before dawn, the first attack came. A gang known as the Black Fangs stormed the outer walls of the prison where Don Carlo was held. They came in trucks, shouting his name, firing wildly. The guards responded with heavy gunfire. None of the attackers survived. The next day, another group tried, a mix of mercenaries and desperate citizens. They met the same fate. Yet the attempts didn't stop. Each death only made the Don's promise feel more powerful, more real. Across the country the body count grew. Streets turned red. Families mourned sons who had gone chasing a dream and never returned. And still whispers filled the night. He'll reward them, some said. He'll escape soon, others believed. He always wins. But President Navarro stood firm. He refused to bend, refused to show fear. He gathered his council and gave a single command. If they won't stop coming, then we must bury him where no one can reach. The war had reached a point of no return. The nation was burning, and the fire had only just begun. The government decided the federal prison wasn't safe enough. Too many attacks. Too many deaths. Too much fear. They had underestimated Don Carlos Santos. Even behind bars, his name carried more power than any government order. His promise, $100 million to whoever freed him, had turned ordinary men into rebels, soldiers into traitors, and the streets into battlefields. So the president and his advisors reached a grim conclusion. They would move him. The plan was drawn in secret. Don Carlo would be transferred to a classified underground facility, buried deep beneath the capital. A place so secure that even light had to be cleared to enter. Only a handful of top officials knew the route. The mission was called Operation Silence. But secrecy dies quickly in a land he once ruled. Whispers began to move through the underworld faster than any official report. A guard spoke too loudly at a bar. A driver mentioned strange new orders. A mechanic noticed armored trucks being refitted overnight. Piece by piece the information spread. Within hours the entire city knew. The king was being moved. When dawn came, thousands poured into the streets. Men, women, teenagers, some armed, most desperate. Some came out of loyalty, others out of greed. But they all came for one reason: Don Carlos Santos. They filled the roads, chanting his name. Carlo, Carlo, Carlo. The sound echoed across buildings, bouncing through alleys and squares like thunder. Shopkeepers locked their doors. Parents pulled their children inside. Reporters rushed to rooftops to film the madness below. It was more than a protest. It was a movement, wild and uncontrollable. At noon the convoy began to roll out. 3 armored trucks led the way, followed by police vehicles and military jeeps. In the center, surrounded by layers of steel, sat the Don. His wrists were chained, his eyes calm, his mind watching everything. From the narrow slit of the window, he saw the city that had once bowed to him. Now it was on fire for him. As the convoy moved slowly through the streets, the crowd surged forward. Some threw stones. Others fired guns into the air. A few brave souls even tried to block the path with cars and burning tires. The soldiers shouted for the crowd to disperse, but no one listened. Then the first gunshot cracked through the air. No one knew who fired it, but once it started, it didn't stop. Chaos erupted. Gunfire burst from every direction. People screamed and scattered. Soldiers opened fire to clear the roads. bullets tearing through smoke and shouting. Men fell. Women cried out. Teenagers dropped where they stood, their dreams of money dying with them. By dusk, the streets were painted red. Bodies lay across the pavement, mixed with broken glass and the flickering light of burning cars. The city that had once feared Don Carlo was now bleeding for him. Inside the armored truck, the Don leaned back in his seat, calm amid the storm. The sound of gunfire outside was like music to him, the sound of loyalty, of devotion, of chaos he had created with nothing more than words. A faint smile curled on his lips. Even caged, he said softly, they fight for me. The guard sitting opposite him swallowed hard, pretending not to hear. He could feel the weight of those words. He knew they weren't just pride, they were prophecy. The convoy finally reached the outskirts of the capital. There, hidden beneath layers of concrete and steel, was the underground prison. It wasn't marked on any map. It had no name, no windows, no sound from the outside world. When they arrived, the soldiers moved quickly. No speeches, no hesitation. They dragged Don Carlo down a long metal staircase that seemed to sink forever. The air grew colder with every step. At the bottom, a heavy iron door opened. Inside was a single cell, bare walls, a single light, no contact with the world above. The soldiers locked him in and left without a word. The door slammed shut with a final, echoing thud. For the first time in years, the great Don Carlos Santos was truly alone. But even as silence filled the room, he smiled once more. Because outside, the fire still burned, and the people were still chanting his name. The new prison was buried beneath concrete and silence. It was a place designed to erase men from the world. No windows. No visitors. No light. Deep underground, where even the sound of footsteps seemed afraid to echo, Don Carlos Santos sat alone. His cell was nothing but gray walls, a steel bed, and a single bulb that flickered weakly overhead. The air was heavy, cold, and still, thick with the weight of forgotten souls. The guards called it the pit, and they said even the devil would go mad if left there too long. For weeks, Carlos said nothing. He didn't shout, didn't curse, didn't beg. He simply sat, his eyes fixed on the door, his mind sharp and alive. The world above might have thought he was buried, but Carlos Santos was not a man who died easily. Even in that pit, his influence began to seep through the cracks. It started with whispers. Guards spoke his name in secret, their voices trembling. Some had once worked for him. Others had relatives who owed him favors. His presence infected them, like a shadow creeping along the walls. Soon, small things began to change. Food that was meant to be plain became richer. A missing cigarette appeared under his bed. A guard lingered longer than he should have, lowering his eyes when Carlo looked up. And then came the phones, smuggled in by trembling hands. First one, then another. Messages were sent. Short, coded, impossible to trace. Each one carried orders, instructions, reminders. Even in isolation, Don Carlo ruled. The guards didn't speak of it, but they all felt it. Somehow, the man in cell 9 was still giving orders to the outside world. Somehow, his empire still obeyed him. Outside, the chaos refused to die. Every day brought new attacks, new funerals, new screams. Gangs that had once fought each other now fought the government together. Police stations were burned. Armored vehicles were ambushed. Whole districts fell into darkness at night, ruled by gunfire and whispers of loyalty to the Don. The nation was bleeding. News reports played endless footage of riots, explosions, and bodies covered with flags. Mothers cried on television. The president's voice grew tighter with each speech. But no matter what he said, people still believed in Don Carlo. To the poor, he was a hero, a man who defied the government that had forgotten them. To the desperate, he was hope, the only one who had ever offered them something real, even if it was only money. His name became a song, a chant, a battle cry. For the Don. For the King of Men. The sound of it reached the walls of the underground prison, carried by guards who dared not speak too loudly. Carlo would smile faintly when he heard the echoes from above. Even caged in the earth, he was still the center of the world. Meanwhile, in the capital, the pressure was growing. The president's advisors warned that the country was on the brink of collapse. Roads were unsafe. Banks were closing. Entire police units were refusing to go into the streets. President Elias Navarro called for an emergency meeting at the palace. The air in the council chamber was heavy, every face drawn with exhaustion. "He's a virus," Navarro said, his voice low but firm. "As long as he lives, the nation burns." The room fell silent. No one dared disagree. Every man in that room had seen the numbers, the casualties, the losses, the rising panic. Carlo's promise of $100 million had become more powerful than any speech, any order, any law. For the first time they all understood the truth. Arresting Don Carlos Santos had not ended his reign, it had made him immortal. And so, for the first time the room agreed. If peace was ever to return, the Don could not live. The execution order was signed at midnight. The room was silent except for the slow ticking of the clock on the wall. A storm gathered outside, thunder rumbling like a distant warning. The president's desk was covered with papers, reports of riots, death tolls, burnt buildings and blood-soaked streets. The nation was breaking apart, piece by piece, under the shadow of one man. President Elias Navarro sat alone, staring at the sheet of paper in front of him, the official order for Don Carlos Santos' execution. His pen hovered above the line for what felt like hours. Every fiber of his being screamed that this was necessary. But another voice, softer and more human, asked if killing a man like Don Carlo would end the chaos, or make it worse. He rubbed his temples and whispered to the empty room. "If I spare him," he said, "I lose my country." Those words were quiet, but they carried the weight of a nation. With a deep breath, Navarro signed his name. His pen scratched across the paper like a final judgment. The order was sealed. The guards waiting outside entered the room, saluted, and left to deliver the message. It was done. At dawn, the nation awoke to a single announcement that echoed through every radio, every television, every phone. Don Carlos Santos will hang at sunrise. The word struck the country like lightning. The streets filled within hours. From the poorest neighborhoods to the rich districts, people poured into the capital. Men, women, children, even the elderly. Some came to witness justice. Others came to fight it. For some, Don Carlo was a criminal who had poisoned their land with fear. For others, he was a savior, a man who had stood up to the powerful and promised them a better life. The city was divided, and the air trembled with tension. Shouts filled the air. Mercy for the Don. Death to the tyrant. Posters of his face were held high, some painted with halos, others with horns. The army lined the streets, rifles ready, eyes hard. Soldiers stood shoulder to shoulder, blocking every road leading to the prison. Helicopters hovered above the rooftops. Snipers were placed on the government buildings. The capital looked like a battlefield before the first shot. Inside the palace, Navarro watched the chaos unfold on the live screens. His heart was heavy, but his face stayed firm. He had made his decision. He knew that if he faltered now, everything he had fought for, peace, order, justice, would vanish. Still, the weight of it pressed on him like a mountain. He turned to his generals. "Keep the people back," he ordered. "No one crosses that line." The generals nodded, but he could see doubt in their eyes. They too knew who Don Carlo was, not just a man but a myth, one whose name had ruled them all for years. As the sun began to rise, the sky turned red, a color that seemed to match the blood already spilled for the Don. In the streets, the crowds grew louder. Mothers wept. Young men shouted they would die before letting the king of men hang. Old followers clutched their rosaries, praying for a miracle. Inside the underground prison, guards prepared for the execution in silence. They spoke in whispers, careful not to look into the Don's eyes for too long. They feared that even now, with his power fading, one look could turn them into traitors. Above ground, time slowed. President Navarro stood by his office window, watching the rising sun. His reflection looked older, wearier. He knew that this day would define his life, and his soul. Far below, the final preparations were being made. The rope was ready. The platform was built. Outside, the chanting grew into a roar that shook the ground. The Don's name echoed through the streets like thunder, rolling, unstoppable, alive. And though Navarro had signed the order, he wondered deep down whether he had just saved his country, or buried it alongside the King of Men. When they brought Don Carlos Santos out, the sky was gray and heavy with rain. Dark clouds rolled over the city, hanging low, as if the heavens themselves were mourning. The air was cold and thick, every drop of rain hitting the ground with a slow, hollow rhythm. It was the kind of mourning that made even soldiers uneasy. They led Carlo up from the underground prison through a narrow corridor lined with guards. No one spoke. Boots echoed softly against concrete walls. The sound of chains clinked in rhythm with his footsteps. He wore black, the same color he had always favored, pressed neatly, spotless, as though he had dressed for a royal ceremony rather than his own death. His hair was slicked back, untouched by fear or time. His eyes were calm, steady, unreadable. Even in chains, he looked like a ruler walking to his throne. As he stepped into the open courtyard, the world erupted in flashes. Cameras zoomed in from every angle, capturing the moment history would never forget. Reporters whispered into microphones. Soldiers tightened their grips on their rifles. The rain fell harder. Carlo stood on the platform, the wooden boards creaking softly beneath his feet. The hangman adjusted the rope, his hands trembling. Around them, soldiers formed a tight circle, watching nervously. Above, helicopters hovered, their lights cutting through the mist. For a long moment, the Don said nothing. His gaze swept across the crowd, the faces behind the barricades, the people who had once feared him, loved him, and followed him. Some wept openly. Others shouted his name. Even now, as the noose hung inches from his neck, Don Carlos Santos commanded attention. He lifted his head and looked straight into one of the cameras, his expression calm, his voice strong. "You can kill the man," he said, "but you can never kill the name." The words carried through the speakers, through the city, through the nation. They echoed in homes, in shops, in the hearts of millions watching live. And in that instant, everyone knew he wasn't afraid. The hangman hesitated. The warden gave a silent nod. The rope was tightened. The platform beneath his feet groaned. The Don closed his eyes briefly, not in fear but in peace. Then the lever was pulled. The platform dropped. The king of men fell. For a moment the rain stopped. The city froze. No sound, no movement, only silence. A silence so deep it seemed to swallow the world. Even the storm paused to listen. Then somewhere in the crowd, a single cry broke out, a wail of grief raw and uncontrollable. Others followed. Some shouted his name again and again, their voices rising like thunder. But the soldiers didn't move. The cameras kept rolling. The world watched as the body of Don Carlos Santos hung lifeless, swaying slightly in the cold morning air. Hours later, President Elias Navarro appeared on national television. His face was pale but firm, his eyes shadowed with exhaustion. He looked straight into the camera and spoke the words that would mark the end of an era. "The era of fear is over," he declared. "Let the nation begin again." His tone was steady, but his hands trembled slightly as he folded the speech. Behind him, the flag fluttered weakly in the storm. When the broadcast ended, the country did not cheer. There were no songs, no celebrations, no applause. The streets were too quiet, too haunted. Shops remained closed. Churches stayed open late into the night. People lit candles on street corners, whispering prayers for the man they had both loved and feared. In the rain-soaked city of San Meridio, the lights flickered, and the air felt hollow, as if something enormous had been taken from it. The king was dead. But in the silence that followed, in the stillness of the streets, one truth lingered. Legends don't die. They only wait to be reborn. Weeks passed. The killing stopped. The gunfire that once echoed through the streets of San Meridio slowly faded into memory. The riots ended, the fires died down, and the smell of smoke was replaced by the heavy scent of rain and dust. For the first time in months, the city slept without fear. Shops reopened. Schools resumed. Families dared to smile again. The news spoke of peace, the kind that comes after war, fragile and uncertain, but peace nonetheless. The people tried to move on. The government tried to rebuild. But though the surface was calm, underneath it all, something still stirred. In the crowded slums, where Don Carlos Santos had once been both protector and god, people whispered in the dark. They whispered stories that refused to die. Some said the Don had survived. That the man who had been hanged was only a double, a decoy meant to fool the cameras. Others swore they had seen him, in the back of a black car that sped through the night, or walking through the old docks wearing a hood, alive, untouchable, unstoppable. And then there was the greatest rumor of all, the one that spread like wildfire. They said the $100 million was still out there. Hidden somewhere in San Meridio. Buried in vaults, locked in safes, spread across secret accounts. Men who had once fought over scraps now dreamed of treasure. Treasure promised by a dead man. Every alley had its own version of the story. Some said it was under the old cathedral. Others said it was buried beneath the docks where the Don first built his empire. And each night, more and more people searched, digging through rubble, breaking into warehouses, chasing ghosts. The myth of Don Carlos Santos had become larger than the man himself. Graffiti began to appear on city walls overnight, sprayed in thick black paint. The letters were bold, defiant, and alive. "The king never dies." Those 4 words began to appear everywhere. On buses, on bridges, on the sides of government buildings. No one knew who wrote them, but everyone knew what they meant. He was gone, but not forgotten. President Elias Navarro stood on his palace balcony one night, looking out over the capital. From where he stood, the city looked peaceful, lights flickering like stars across the dark horizon. But in the distance, faintly carried by the wind, he could still hear them. The chants, the voices, the name. Carlo. 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 He closed his eyes, his hands gripping the railing tightly. He had won. He had destroyed the king of men, ended the bloodshed, saved the country. But the victory felt hollow. There were no cheers, no celebration. Only silence, heavy and watchful. The kind of silence that follows after something too great to be forgotten. He had killed the man. But not the idea. Navarro turned and walked back into his office, the echoes still following him. He could silence the people, silence the streets, but he couldn't silence the memory of Don Carlos Santos. Because legends don't die in prisons or on gallows. They live in memory, in whispers, in stories, in the fear that clings to a nation long after the guns go silent. Children who had never met him spoke his name like a ghost story. Old men told tales of the Don's power as if they had seen him rise from the dead. Every shadow seemed to carry a piece of him. And somewhere, deep beneath the streets of San Meridio, where the city's oldest tunnels twisted through darkness, the myth still ruled. In the bars they raised their glasses to him. In the prisons his name was still carved into the walls. In the hearts of many he was still alive. Because Don Carlos Santos was never just a man. He was a symbol, of fear, of loyalty, of power. And though his body was gone, his spirit still walked the streets he once owned. Down there, in the dark where laws couldn't reach and truth no longer mattered, one name still held power above all others, whispered softly, almost reverently. Don Carlos Santos, the King of Men. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like, share and subscribe for more interesting stories.